Welcome to Conservation System Design. This video will overview some of the key concepts and theories that we will be drawing on throughout the course. This course is focused on biodiversity conservation and conservation systems and networks. Let's start by going through what all of these terms mean. First, biodiversity is defined as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Basically, it's all of the life on Earth in all of its different forms. Conservation is defined as the protection, care, management, and maintenance of ecosystems, habitats, wildlife species, and populations within or outside of their natural environments in order to safeguard the natural conditions for their long-term permanence. So if we take these two terms together, it means that the core goal of biodiversity conservation is to protect and maintain the variability of all living organisms and the ecological complexes that they are a part of in perpetuity or over the long term. This is obviously a huge task, and in reality, it is impossible to conserve all biodiversity, as there are limited resources to put towards conservation, and conservation has to be balanced with other land uses such as agriculture and extractive resource uses. So a big part of conservation in practice is working to figure out where to direct our limited resources so that they will result in the maximum amount of biodiversity conservation. And a major theme of this course will be learning about all of the different tools that have been developed to help conservation scientists and policymakers determine how to best direct these limited resources. There are a number of different tools and mechanisms that we can use to help protect biodiversity, and we generally think about these things as either being part of a biodiversity conservation system or a biodiversity conservation network. A biodiversity conservation system is all of the different pieces of the puzzle that work to conserve biodiversity. It's things like individual protected areas, conservation easements, and zoos. Here we see the protected areas system of Nova Scotia and Canada, all of the protected areas that make up these systems. The core unit of many of these biodiversity conservation systems, and something that we'll be talking about a lot throughout this course, is protected areas. Protected areas are clearly defined geographical spaces, in other words, they can be drawn on a map, that are recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or some other effective means in order to achieve the long-term conservation of nature, along with all of its associated ecosystem services and cultural values. Examples of protected areas include national and provincial parks, designated wilderness areas, marine protected areas, and Indigenous protected and conserved areas. The main scientific theory at the heart of biodiversity conservation systems, and something that we will be talking about a lot in this course, is island biogeography, which was developed in the late 1960s by Harvard biologists Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson. The theory has two main components. First is that the bigger an island is, the more species it will have. And secondly, the further an island is from the mainland, the fewer species it will have. Over the years, a number of different explanations have been developed to help explain these core principles of island biogeography. But in general, with larger islands, there is likely to be more variety in the types of habitats present, which increases the likelihood that the island will be able to support more species, and therefore have a higher biodiversity. The closer an island is to the mainland, the higher the likelihood that species will be able to make their way to it. For example, for animals that need to swim to reach an island, it is more likely that they will be able to get to an island that is 1 kilometer away compared to one that's 10 kilometers away. MacArthur and Wilson originally developed their theory to explain patterns of biodiversity on islands in the ocean, but scientists quickly learned to adapt the theory to patches of habitat on the mainland. In this photo, we can think about the patches of forest as like islands surrounded by an ocean of farmland. The larger the patches are, the more species they are likely to host, and similarly, the closer they are to that big patch of forest in the background of the photo, the more species they are likely to have. Throughout the 20th century, the theory of island biogeography heavily influenced conservation and protected areas management. The goal was generally to establish as large of protected areas as possible, and protected areas were viewed as islands of protection, as havens for biodiversity in a sea of human use. However, towards the end of the 20th century, scientists started to realize that this model was actually a bit inadequate for conservation. In part, this was because of advances in technology for tracking wildlife. One of the most famous examples of this came in 1991, when scientists put a radio collar on a wolf named Pluie in Alberta's Peter Lougheed Provincial Park and began to track her movements. After a few months, there was suddenly no sign of her, and it was assumed that either her or her radio collar were dead. Then researchers got a huge surprise. A NASA satellite picked up the signal from Pluie's collar in northern Montana, hundreds of kilometers south of where she was expected to be. Over the next year and a half, scientists tracked her movements, which are shown in the graphic here. She crisscrossed parts of Alberta, Montana, Idaho, Washington State, and British Columbia, covering an area about the same size as Switzerland, or about 150 times the size of the protected area where she was first collared. And as you can see in this graphic, much of her journey was outside of protected areas. This got scientists starting to rethink conservation and starting to think about the importance of connectivity and how easy it is for wildlife to move around the landscape and in between key protected areas. Conservation was beginning to be thought of on larger and larger scales. What was clear from the Pluie example and others like it was that for biodiversity conservation to be successful, it was going to have to operate on huge, even continental scales. So now we tend to think about biodiversity conservation through the lens of a network. The components of a protected areas system are still important, but now we are really focused on how well they work together, how the entire puzzle of the landscape fits together to work towards the conservation of biodiversity. Throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century, conservation plans on massive scales began to be developed. The first, and perhaps the most famous of these, is the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, or Y2Y, which is shown here on the left. The idea of Y2Y is to link key protected areas between Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming to the Yukon Territory through wildlife corridors across the length of the Rocky Mountains. A similar plan was developed by the Wildlands Network a few years later to link landscapes in eastern North America from Florida and the Gulf of Mexico to Atlantic Canada, which is shown here on the right. These plans were then ambitiously linked together through the Wildlands Network's Continental Conservation Initiative, a vision which seeks to allow for the free and unimpeded movement of wildlife all across North America. At the core of the Biodiversity Conservation Network is the science of landscape ecology. As its name implies, landscape ecology is the study of landscapes. Specifically, it looks at the patterns of composition, structure, and function of landscapes. It involves the study of these patterns, the interaction among different elements of these patterns, and how these patterns and interactions change over time. Landscape ecology also involves the application of these principles to solving real-world problems. When applying landscape ecology to conservation, we often end up thinking about the core corridor model, which is illustrated here, and thinking about patches of natural habitat as either being cores, corridors, or isolated patches. Core areas are large, continuous patches of intact natural ecosystems that can act as primary habitat for a number of species. Core areas are often targeted to become protected areas, as they are often the largest patches of habitat available on a landscape. The connections between these core areas, which may or may not be continuous, are called corridors. We will get into more detail about the different types of corridors in a later week of the course, but for now, take a look at the photo here on the right. The larger patch of forest near the water, that would be our core area. And the narrow pieces of forest that you can see coming out of that core area would be the corridors. There's also an isolated patch of forest near the middle of the picture, which, because it's not too far away from the other patches, could act as a stepping stone for those species that are able to move across agricultural fields.